We all know the story. In 1776, the colonies declared independence. In 1789, George Washington placed his hand on a Bible and became the first president of the United States. But what happened in the 13 years between those two events? It is a period often glossed over in history books, a lost decade where the American experiment almost died in its infancy. This was the Confederation Period. It was a time when the United States wasn't a single nation, but a firm league of friendship between sovereign states. It was a time when we had a government with no head of state, no judiciary, and no power to tax. And perhaps most surprisingly to many, it was a time when men did hold the title of President of the United States in Congress assembled, long before George Washington took the oath. Today, we open the vault on the chaotic, desperate, and revolutionary era before the American presidency. To understand this era, we have to understand the fear that gripped the Founding Fathers. Having just fought a war against a distant, powerful king, the last thing they wanted was to create a new one. In 1777, the Continental Congress proposed the Articles of Confederation, which wasn't fully ratified until 1781. This document created a government that was intentionally weak. There was no executive branch to enforce laws. There was no Supreme Court to settle disputes. There was only a unicameral Congress where every state, regardless of size, had exactly one vote. Under the Articles, the United States was, in the words of George Washington, a rope of sand. Congress could declare war, but it could not draft soldiers. It could sign treaties, but it could not force states to honor them. Perhaps most crippling of all, it had no authority to levy taxes. It could only ask states for money, requests that were routinely ignored. This was the government that tried to manage the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. And while we remember Washington as the military hero who resigned his commission in 1783, effectively ending the war, we rarely talk about the men who tried to govern the peace. If you were to ask a trivia buff who the first president of the United States was, they might say George Washington. But technically, under the Articles of Confederation, there were 8 men appointed by Congress to serve one-year terms as President of the United States in Congress assembled. These weren't executives with veto power or command of the armies. They were moderators, presiding officers designed to be weak. The first was John Hanson of Maryland, who served from 1781 to 1782. While his powers were limited, his tenure was historic. He was the first to serve the full one-year term specified by the Articles. During his presidency, he approved the Great Seal of the United States that we still use today, and he officially received General Washington after the victory at Yorktown. He was followed by Elias Boudinot, who spent his childhood living next door to Benjamin Franklin. It was President Boudinot who signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, officially ending the Revolutionary War. Then came Thomas Mifflin, a former Major General who had been involved in the Conway Cabal, a plot to replace Washington during the war. Ironically, it was President Mifflin who accepted Washington's resignation as Commander-in-Chief in 1783. Richard Henry Lee followed, the man who had originally introduced the Resolution for Independence in 1776. Even the famous John Hancock served a term, though poor health kept him from performing many of his duties. Nathaniel Gorham, Arthur St. Clair, and finally Cyrus Griffin rounded out this list of forgotten leaders. These men presided over a Congress that was slowly losing the faith of the people. They held the gavel, but they held no real power. And without power, the nation began to unravel. The most immediate crisis was money. To finance the revolution, the Continental Congress had printed paper money known as Continentals. But because Congress couldn't tax to back this currency up, Its value relied entirely on public confidence. As the war dragged on, that confidence evaporated. In 1779 alone, the money supply grew by 170%. By 1780, Congress was forced to devalue the currency, trading 40 old dollars for one new dollar. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," became a common American idiom for worthlessness. Enter Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance, often called the financier or even the dictator by his critics. He tried to stabilize the economy by creating the Bank of North America in 1781 and pledging his own personal assets to back government obligations. But even Morris couldn't fix the structural flaw. He proposed a 5% levy on imports to give the central government a source of revenue. It required unanimous consent. 12 states agreed. Rhode Island said no. The measure failed. This fiscal impotence had dangerous consequences. In 1783, the Army, unpaid and disgruntled, threatened mutiny. In the Newburgh Conspiracy, officers discussed turning against Congress. It took a dramatic speech by George Washington to talk them down. Later that year, angry soldiers marched on Philadelphia, forcing Congress to flee the capital and relocate to Princeton, New Jersey. The government was bankrupt, homeless, and powerless, and things were about to get violent. By 1786, the economic depression had hit the farmers of Massachusetts hard. Many of them were veterans of the Revolution. They had fought for liberty, but now they faced foreclosure. The state government, trying to pay off its own war debts, had raised taxes and demanded payment in hard currency, gold and silver that these farmers simply didn't have. Led by Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, the farmers rebelled. In August 1786, 1,500 of them marched on government buildings, shutting down courthouses to stop the foreclosure trials. The rebellion terrified the nation's elite. Massachusetts asked Congress for help, but here was the ultimate failure of the Articles of Confederation. Congress had no soldiers to send and no money to raise them. The federal government was helpless. Ultimately, a private army raised by wealthy merchants and led by Benjamin Lincoln crushed Shays' rebellion in the winter of 1787. But the message was clear. As George Washington wrote, the country was teetering on the edge of anarchy and confusion. The experiment in self-government was failing. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, the Confederation Congress managed one piece of legislation that would shape the future of the continent. With the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the U.S. had acquired vast lands west of the Appalachians. How would this land be settled? Would it be colonies of the old states or something new? In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance. It established a precedent that the United States would expand not by creating colonies, but by admitting new, equal states. Crucially, Article 6 of the Ordinance contained a provision that stunned many. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. Why did Southern delegates, who fought so hard to protect slavery later, agree to this? Some, like Virginian William Grayson, believed that banning slavery there would prevent the Northwest from competing with the South in tobacco and indigo production. Others thought the territory would be settled by New Englanders anyway. Regardless of the motive, this act created a free soil border at the Ohio River. It ensured that when states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois joined the Union, they would enter as free states, shifting the balance of power for generations to come. It was a rare triumph for a dying government. By 1786, the trade wars between the states were becoming unbearable. New York taxed goods from New Jersey. States minted their own worthless money. A meeting was called in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss trade regulation. Only 12 delegates from 5 states showed up, but among them were Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They used this failure to call for something bigger, a convention in Philadelphia the following May, not just to discuss trade, but to revise the entire system of government. In May 1787, Delegates began to arrive at the Pennsylvania State House. The mood was tense. Rhode Island refused to send anyone, but the arrival of George Washington, who had been coaxed out of retirement, gave the meeting legitimacy. They met in secret. They nailed the windows shut to prevent eavesdropping, despite the sweltering summer heat. And almost immediately, they did something radical. They didn't just fix the Articles of Confederation. They threw them out entirely. Two visions for America clashed in that hot room. The Virginia Plan, engineered by James Madison, proposed a powerful national government with 3 branches and a bicameral Congress based on population. This terrified the small states, who feared they would be swallowed up. The New Jersey Plan countered, arguing for a one-state, one-vote system, keeping the structure of the Confederation but giving it slightly more power. The debate threatened to break up the convention. It was Roger Sherman of Connecticut who proposed the Great Compromise, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for every state. But the darkest bargain was over slavery. Southern states wanted enslaved people to count toward their population to gain more seats in Congress. Northern states argued that if they were property, they shouldn't count at all. The result was the infamous 3/5 compromise, where enslaved individuals would be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. They also agreed to allow the Atlantic slave trade to continue for another 20 years, until 1808. It was a covenant with death, as later abolitionists would call it, but it kept the fragile Union together. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the new Constitution. But the battle wasn't over. It had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. A fierce public debate erupted. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, argued for the new system in the Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalists warned that a strong central government would become a tyranny, just like the British monarchy. They demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, a promise that eventually secured the support of key states like Massachusetts and Virginia. One by one, the states ratified. On July 2, 1788, Congress officially accepted the ratification. The old government, the Congress of the Confederation, met for the last time. It set the dates for the first presidential election. On April 30, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office in New York City. The era of the presidents in Congress assembled, Hanson, Boudinot, St. Clair, and the rest, was over. The era of the presidency had begun. Historians often call the 1780s the critical period. It was a decade where the economy collapsed, rebellion broke out, and the very existence of the United States was in doubt. But it was also a decade of profound creativity. In the fires of that crisis, the founders realized that a league of friendship was not enough. They learned that liberty requires structure. They learned that a government without the power to function is just as dangerous as a government with too much power. The next time you look at a dollar bill or hear "Hail to the Chief," remember the lost decade. Remember the forgotten presidents and the rope of sand. Because without the failures of the Confederation, we never would have had the Constitution. This has been the Memory Bank.